And Goliath. First off, I'm wearing my fancy shirt, so I need all of you to understand this is very serious because I'm in my fancy shirt. So, David and Goliath. The first thing I want to cover is how the story is usually told, because I want all of us to be on the same page, working with kind of the same basis of what's going on in this story, and then we'll get into the deeper dive and the real version, the truth of it. So the story of David and Goliath, often told in Sunday schools and Veggie Tales and people who want to feel like they can do really big things. David and Goliath starts out with this little shepherd boy. Little shepherd boy's name is David. Little shepherd boy is just a scrappy wee lad, and one day he decides, hey, I'm going to go to war. And his dad is like, hey, take your brother some food. And so he does. He takes his brother some food, and they're like, hey, Scraps, what are you doing here? And he's like, I don't know, I brought you guys pizza. I don't think they might have pizza, who knows? There was tomatoes and cheese and bread. So let's just say it was pizza. So he brought him pizza, and they were like, well, you better get out of here. And then there's this really big guy, and really big guy's name is Goliath. He's a Philistine. These are the enemies of God's people at the time because there's a war going on. So there's a war going on, and this one really big Philistine guy named Goliath is like, hey, y'all suck. Your God sucks. That's not me saying it, that's Goliath. And so that's what Goliath says, and David's like, hey, he can't talk to us like that. And the big guys of David's brothers, people, are like, well, he can kind of say what he wants because he's massive. And this really big guy challenges one of the Israelites, David's people, to a fight. And he says, if y'all can beat me one-on-one, fight's over, right? Like Rocky III in the Cold War. For those of you who have seen Rocky III. So David is like, yeah, I'll do it, whatever. And again, David's a scrappy little guy. He's a child. And this is a very tall, very large, trained warrior. His whole life has been war. And so all the guys are like, you're going to die, but we're not going to stop you. So David goes to the king, and the king is like, wear my armor. And then he gives David his armor, which is like way too big because David is scraps. And he's like, all right, this ain't gonna work. I can't move in this. And so David takes off the armor and he goes to a river, right? And remember, David's a shepherd, so he has his little shepherd stick, and he has a sling, right? Which is like, a lot of people think, and so David has those two things, his shepherd tools. He goes to a river, and he picks up some rocks, and he goes to fight this Goliath guy. And again, Goliath's like, hey, you ain't crap, I'm a big guy. And David's like, haha, and then he shoots his slingshot, hits Goliath in the head, and Goliath dies. A lot of the time when we hear this story, the message that people kind of try to give is like, little guys can do big things too, because God fights our battles for us. Ding! And I hate to inform you, but that is not what the story of David and Goliath is necessarily. I'm not going to say it's wrong, but it's also not the fullness of what this story is. So, let's talk about what actually happened in the story of David and Goliath. It does start with David being a shepherd. That is absolutely true. I know, I knew you would love that, Will. Don't you like his hat? It's so pretty. So it did start off with David being a shepherd. He was a shepherd for his father. I don't know what that is. That's fine, we'll get back to it. So, David was a shepherd. David worked for his father, and his father's name was Jesse. David often worked out in the fields, but he did have a second job. David did have a second job. His second job was that he actually was a harp player for the king. This is something that we see back in the last chapter, that he had begun to live with the king. That is not my account. I don't know what's happening. I don't know, honestly. If you click this slide right here, that says David and Goliath. Right there. Yep. Is that going to do it? It says click to full screen. But it doesn't full screen.
I got this.
Alright, I believe in you. Wait, can you just double click over here? Hey! Things.
Well done.
So, David also is a harp player for the king. This is really important because in the last chapter, we see that he wasn't just a harp player for the king, but the king at the time was being tormented by demons. And so David actually was given the ability by playing the harp to soothe the king's torture. And so David had one job of being a shepherd, and then another really important job of working for the king. So he was kind of in between two places. He was in between his father's house and his fields and the king's temple, right? So, next slide. David had to deliver some food. It was very important that his brothers got their food while they were out at war. So David becomes a pizza delivery boy. We can go to the next slide. That's really all I have to say about that. We are in 1 Samuel, if y'all want to turn to that. I really should know the chapter. I believe it's 14. 17? Excellent. 17. So it'll be 1 Samuel 17, and then we're going to start at verse 34. Talking about David being a shepherd, okay? So, let's talk about what a shepherd was. Because a lot of times when we think of shepherd, we think of the old guy in the field watching the sheep. That's not what these shepherds were. So, David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. When a lion or bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears. I'll do it again to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Shepherds were not a stranger to violence. If I could just get the next slide up here while I talk about this. These are the animals that David would have been fighting. I did research this. These are the actual, this is the type of lion and that's the type of bear that would be found in the area. Their bite force is 160 to 1,000 pounds for this lion here. And the bear has a bite force of 1,160 pounds. David grabs these things by the jaw and clubs them to death. That's what David did. That was his thing. That was half of what he did with his life, was fight these animals and protect sheep. Okay? So David was not a stranger to violence. David was fully aware of how to fight and how to kill something much bigger than him. Okay? It was his specialty. Next. So, his relationship with the King Saul. Again, like I said, he was in Saul's court. So, this is back in the last chapter, right? So this is in 16. So David went to Saul and began serving him. Saul loved David very much, and David became his armor bearer. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, asking, "Please let David remain in my service, for I am very pleased with him." And whenever the tormenting spirit from God troubled Saul, David would play the harp. Then Saul would feel better, and the tormenting spirit would go away. So, David has an important relationship to Saul. Saul's the king of Israel. David would essentially be like his all-time feel-good pill. So Saul had like anxiety, depression, he had some pretty crazy thoughts. He was being tormented by this evil spirit. When David played the harp, that spirit no longer would torment Saul. And so Saul would get this time of reprieve from the torment that was going on in his mind. So it says Saul loved David very much, and David became his armor bearer. Armor bearer was an important job. Armor bearer is where we get the phrase right-hand man, because in a war, right, your armor bearer, your shield bearer, would stand to your right side, because your shield would be held in your left hand, and your sword would be held in your right. And so your right side would be left unguarded. And so the person who was your shield bearer, your armor bearer, he would stand to your right to make sure that you didn't take a hit from your blind side. So Saul not only loved him very much and trusted him in his court, but Saul trusted him with his life. That's what this is saying. So the next slide. Then, this is back to 17, right? We're talking about David and Goliath again. This is when David went to the king, right? David went to the king, Saul, and said, hey, I'm going to fight that guy. And Saul then gave David his own armor. So this was the king's armor. This was the armor of a grown man. A bronze helmet and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off again. So, Saul tried to protect David because he was worried. He was worried he was going to lose this kid who had the ability to stop his torment, right? This was an important kid to him. And so he was like, this guy's going to die. I need to make sure he has the best chance at not dying. So he was worried, and he worked out of panic, right? Next slide. Again. Oh, no. We can go back because it's different highlighted stuff. Don't worry. I see you, though. I see you working ahead. So, an important thing to point out. So far, everyone David has talked to has assumed that this was going to be a hand-to-hand fight. Saul gave him a sword. And David says, I'm not used to a sword. I've never worked with a sword before, and I'm not going to start now, right? Because David, again, even though it wasn't trained in war, David was a very esteemed warrior. He fought lions and bears like it was nothing. So he says, I'm not used to those, I'm not going to use them, right? So, everyone assumes this is going to be a close-range battle. That is not at all what David has in mind. Now we can go to the next slide. Let's talk about the rocks real quick. Because this is the next part of the story, so because it's the next part of the story, I'm going to talk about it, but then we're going to come back to it after I talk about something else. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into a shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. So he picks up these rocks, right? And a lot of people kind of graze over this. They're like, yeah, the 5 rocks he picked up in the river. It's what he used to kill Goliath. And yes, but also there's a way cooler thing if you understand the next slide. Let's talk about what a sling is. A sling is not a... That's not what a sling is. That's a slingshot, which is an American invention. A sling was a rope with a pocket in the middle that the shepherds would move around at very high speeds. And then they would let go of one side of the string, the rock would fly out. And this wasn't a thing that like just shepherds carried or that kids played with. This was a military weapon. There were actually small militias that would use slings. So this wasn't a toy, this was a weapon. To illustrate this point, I'm going to show a modern picture of what this looks like. That guy's holding a sling. There are people nowadays who still use these kind of things. They still study ancient weapons, and they're really into it, and they learn how to use them really well. If I could get that next slide. That picture is a watermelon, 2 seconds after this guy took that last picture. If it's a little blurry, but if we could look here at the red, that is the inside of the watermelon, very much on the outside. If we look at the green part here, somewhere around here, there would have been impact, and then way down here we see the crack, all right? I'm not sure of the exact calculations between a watermelon and a human skull. But looking at this picture, if someone nowadays who barely uses a sling could manage that, I feel like someone who has used a sling many times would be able to, at least get that as their result, okay? So David is coming into this fight with this in mind. This is what David is ready to do. So let's talk about the stones, all right? He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into a shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with the shepherd's staff and his sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. David knew he was going to hit. David didn't think he was going to miss. David was certain he was going to make the shot. Goliath had 4 brothers. So David needed 5 stones just in case the brothers tried to say something. David had faith in God, yes, absolutely. He also had faith in where God had put him and the experience that he had up until this point. David knew exactly what he was doing. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about Goliath for a second, because there's some stuff, I don't need this microphone, I don't know. There's some stuff about Goliath that has been it's a little bit of speculation, okay? It's a little bit of speculation, but we're going to talk about some concrete things and then a little bit of speculation. Just because I think it's a very interesting idea if we account for this other factor that could have been true, okay? So Goliath walked out towards David with his shield bearer ahead of him. Shield bearers were meant to protect their warriors, right? We talked about that. David was a shield bearer. Shield bearers were supposed to protect their warriors from oncoming projectiles. Their whole thing was that they carried a shield. If Goliath was massive, right? If his shield bearer was in front of him, his head would have been unprotected. Because normal-sized guy versus giant guy, normal-sized guy can't cover the head. But again, they're not expecting a long-range fight. Everyone is expecting David to fight Goliath hand-to-hand. So shield bearer is thinking like, little pipsqueak, I'm gonna just stand here, hold my shield out, he's not gonna do nothing. Not expecting David to be a long-ranged combatant. Next slide. So, this is where we get into just a little bit of speculation, because this is an idea that could be true. There's some evidence for it, but the Bible doesn't straight out say it. So I'm going to describe it, and you can take what you believe about it, okay? But I'm going to just share this thought that people have had, that historians and theologians have had, okay? Sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy, am I a dog, he roared, that you come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals. Goliath doesn't mention, he doesn't mention the sling. Goliath had grown up in war. He knew war. War was his whole life. He would have known what a sling was. Because like I said, slings were a military weapon. So, if Goliath would have seen the sling, he would have known what it was and what was about to happen. But he doesn't mention it. However, in the last verse before this, in 41, David had to pull a rock out of his bag to ready it. But it doesn't say he pulled the sling out of his bag, which meant it was in his hand already. So if the sling was already in his hand and he had to pull out the rock to ready it, and Goliath didn't see it, that's weird. Next slide. Unless Goliath was blind. He says come over here, right? So again, he's expecting a close range fight with someone that is in front of him, someone that he can see. Acromegaly is a genetic disorder made famous by people such as Andre the Giant. It's when you get really big because there's a tumor in your head pressing against your growth, the thing that produces your growth hormones. I'm not gonna lie, I did look at the disease. I'm not a science person, so I'm not gonna be able to say the perfect things on this one. But it's with people like Andre the Giant, it's a tumor in your brain that pushes against the thing and makes your body release more growth hormones than usual. It can also press against the oculary nerves, causing extreme nearsightedness. Nearsightedness is when you only see in front of you. So, putting together the facts that Goliath would have known what a sling was, that he grew up in the military, and that he mentions nothing about it, and he was expecting a close range combat. It could be assumed. Again, not telling you guys what to believe, maybe he wasn't, but it could be assumed Goliath could have been blind. But let's talk about something real, right? So, there are two options. Either Goliath was so prideful that he didn't notice the sling, which maybe, there are people who are prideful enough that they don't notice things right in front of them. Or he couldn't even see the threat that was in front of him. He couldn't see that his opponent knew exactly what they were doing. Either way, David was ready for this fight, and Goliath wasn't. One way or another, whether he was blind or he could see, Goliath wasn't ready for what David was about to do. So let's go to the next slide. So, this is 48 through 51. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into a shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from his sheath and used it to kill him to cut off his head. Goliath didn't even get the chance to touch David. Goliath was running at David, and David pulled out this rock and ended the fight in approximately 2 seconds. This fight that everyone else was scared of, this fight that no one else wanted to go into, David finished before it even began. So what does this mean? This is a lot of information, right? This is a lot of information that most people don't talk about with the story of David and Goliath. So, how does that change the story of little guys can do big things too? Well, one, David wasn't a little guy. David knew absolutely what he was doing. He was a warrior. He had killed lions and bears. So it wasn't the little guy. It was the guy that nobody expected. Number two is that Goliath didn't have a chance against David. So what this means is that God knows exactly what he's doing. It's not that God magically guided this rock to Goliath's head and magically made it sink in. The death of Goliath wasn't the miracle in this story. The miracle was that David was exactly who he needed to be. David had exactly what he needed to have. He had the experience that he needed. He had the wisdom that he needed. He had the ability that he needed for this fight. David was a long-range combatant. I'm sure most people have heard the saying, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight. David brought a gun to a knife fight. God had put David in the place he put him, not to show that he could guide a rock, not to show that toys could be weapons. God put David exactly where he did in a fight with a man who had no chance against him that could have killed everyone else. David had a specific purpose, and God had a specific plan for him. In chess, you have a lot of different pieces. And a lot of different pieces do a lot of different things. I personally am very bad at chess, so I'm going to do my best with this one. But in chess, you have a lot of different pieces do a lot of different things. There's the little castle guy who goes straight in 2 directions, right? There's the guy with the weird hat thing with the ball on the head that goes diagonally, right? And then there's the horses who go in L's for some reason. I don't know a lot about chess, but I know they go in L's, and I don't know why. So, in chess, there's a lot of different pieces, and they make a lot of different moves. Someone can help me with this if they know a little bit better, but there are some pieces that even though there's a piece right in front of them, they can't take the piece, they can't attack it, because that's not how they move. There are other pieces that this piece could be like kind of on the other side of the board to the right a little bit in this specific spot, and so this piece is able to take that because that's what it does. The story of David and Goliath is about how God crafts us to do a specific job. and he puts us in specific positions because God is the grandmaster of all chess. I know from the Queen's Gambit that the grandmaster is like the highest chess person. They're like the best person at chess. And so God is the ultimate grandmaster of chess. Each one of us has a past. Each one of us has experiences. Each one of us has abilities that we have been given by God. And so a lot of people talk about like, oh, the giants in my life. There's these giants that they seem impossible. And it's like situations in life, you know? It could be anxiety, it could be depression, it could be a family situation, it could be a situation with your friends, it could be a situation at work, it could be a sickness. There are so many things in life that can go wrong. What the story of David and Goliath tells us is that no matter where we are, no matter what position we are put in, if we are following God and following in His will for our lives, we can trust that the fight is not something that we can't win. God's placed us exactly where we are. He has given us exactly what we needed for each fight that we come into. Let's talk really quickly. It's okay, there's no more slides. There's no more slides. I'm just going to go backtrack in the thing. Yeah, I got you. Let's go back real quick to Saul. Oh, wait, can you go back to Saul? So, let's go back to Saul. Saul tried to change what David was doing. David had a plan. David knew what he was doing. Saul tried to change it because of his own human worry. Saul was worried about him. He was worried about him dying. He was worried about how big Goliath was. And so he tried to give David armor and a sword. Fun thing about chainmail, which is here, coat of mail, chainmail. It's a bunch of metal rings formed together to make a suit of armor. It's heavy. It's real heavy. I don't know if any of you have ever worn a lot of metal. It's not light. And considering it would have been either bronze or iron, that's heavy. Bronze would have been a little less heavy, but if it was iron, that's heavy. A big part of using the sling is that you don't actually spin it in a circle like this so that you only need that little bit of wrist motion. The proper way to do a sling is that it actually goes across your body in a big figure eight. That's a lot of movement to be wearing a couple 50, 75 pounds of armor. That's a lot of movement. And David would have been practiced in the way that he shot his sling. So he would have had a rhythm, he would have had a movement that he perfected over time. And if he was wearing that armor, something that he was not familiar with, he would not have been able to make that shot first try. There would have been recalculating, there would have been like calibration to his movements. It would have been like, this isn't working, I gotta do another thing. He wouldn't have made the first shot. Goliath would have charged him, and that fight could have turned out very differently. So because of Saul's humanly worry, he could have cost David the fight. There's a lot of passages in Scripture, and I'm sure a lot of you know them. Be still and know I am God is one of the biggest examples of the Bible talking about don't fear, don't be afraid of what's to come. Don't worry about the future, for today has its own problems. There is no fear in love. The Bible talks a lot about not being afraid, and I believe this is why. Not only does the story of David and Goliath tell us that we have a purpose and a plan that we are equipped for, but it's a warning against fear and worry. Because fear and worry can change the outcome of your fight. There's this thing in a lot of MMA and martial arts circles about fear. And again, they talk a lot about not being afraid, about keeping your composure, about keeping your head. There's this one video I've seen of a man training a young boy in, I believe, it's either karate or taekwondo. I don't know which, but he's training this boy, and they're practicing dodging a punch. And so the man is swinging this foam tube at the boy's head, and the boy keeps ducking early. And so the man, when he's mid-swing, will just go down and hit him in the back of the head. It's a foam tube. He's not like injuring him or anything, but he'll hit him in the back of the head with his foam tube. And he'll say, "You're so scared of what's coming that you're moving too soon." And he tells the boy, "You need to wait until the perfect moment." And the video goes through him swinging this thing and telling the boy not to be afraid and to look him in the eyes and to watch his opponent, watch what they're doing, and know what he has to do. He even tells the boy, "You know this. You know this. Now do it." And eventually the boy gets to the point where this foam tube is inches from his face, and he ducks down and it goes over his head. There's this other idea of when you're in a fight, right? When fighters will get into the ring, there can be two different types of people. There's that person whose adrenaline is pumping and they're afraid, they're anxious about what's about to happen, and you can see them shaking. And then there's the fighter that's still. The fighter who knows exactly what he's doing and who knows how the fight's about to turn out. We can have full faith in God that He knows the board. He knows the enemy. He knows every move the enemy's going to make. And so when He puts us somewhere, when we're following His will and we end up somewhere, we can't be afraid. We can't let our own worry and fear stop us from doing what God has called us to. Because we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We are stitched together. And God has made us for a time such as this. So I encourage you guys, as we go out, as we go on mission trips and we serve our community, as we disciple others and we teach others that they are loved by God and how to love the way that God has loved them. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of the calling God has put on you. Don't be afraid of the things that you feel conviction for. Know that God has made you. He has led you to this point. We are guided by His word and by His hand. And that He will be with us always. There is no fight that He will give us that we're not prepared for. The question is if we trust Him enough to get through it. I'm going to pray, and we're going to get into a time of worship. But yeah, I encourage you guys. I really do believe that this church is built in a way that's very special. We care about discipleship. We care about the people in our community, the people around us. And I think that God has given us a specific mission. I want us to do it well. I want us to be prepared. And I don't want us to be afraid of what God is calling us to. Let's pray. God,